Hello and welcome to this video on protectionism. In theme so far, we've looked at trade and globalization. We've seen that there's many good things associated with trade and globalization. For example, for customers, better prices, choice and quality. For businesses, economies of scale, more competition and efficiency in the economy, and enables businesses to grow beyond their domestic borders and become multinational companies. However, we've also learned that there are potential disadvantages and downsides. Globalization and trade often leads to specialization, which can sometimes lead to structural unemployment when an industry leaves a country and relocates somewhere else and leaves behind unemployed workers. It can also encourage dependence on other nations. And sometimes globalization is accused of creating a race to the bottom, in which MNCs push for lower taxes and poorer worker conditions and drive down those standards around the world. Now, often to try and combat some of the negative sides of trade and globalization, countries will resort to what is known as protectionism. And that is the topic in this video today. So we're going to look at what is meant by protectionism, the 4 different methods that a government might try and use to introduce protectionism, and then evaluate the use of these methods. So let's start off with what protectionism is. It's usually done by governments, and it involves implementing measures designed to restrict free trade or reduce the level of imports. So this involves the creation of trade barriers, trying to prevent imports from entering a domestic or a local national market. So why would a country want to reduce the level of imports? Well, there are a whole host of reasons why a country might want to do that, or a government might want to do that. For example, to protect geriatric or infant industries, which we'll discuss in a bit more detail in a second. To protect jobs, again, we'll discuss that in a second. Often they do it to try and help the balance of trade within the economy, to try and encourage more exports than the level of imports to improve the economy's performance. Sometimes countries want to restrict imports from countries that have poor health and safety or environmental regulations. Sometimes they want to restrict the level of imports for strategic reasons. For example, agriculture might be a relevant one here, where you would want to maybe restrict your importation of food to encourage domestic farmers to produce more food, so you are more secure in the future. If there was, say, a poor harvest or a war broke out, then you would be more self-sufficient. Often governments can generate tax revenue through applying taxes on imports. Sometimes governments will wish to restrict imports in retaliation to other countries if they feel that the other countries are unfairly trying to gain an advantage in terms of international trade, perhaps by lowering their exchange rate or subsidizing their companies. Then governments may wish to retaliate by trying to block some of those imports into their country. And lastly, to prevent dumping, which again we'll talk about in a second. So there were 3 key reasons there that we said we would talk about in a bit more detail. The first of it one is to protect infant industries. So an infant industry is a young industry, perhaps a new industry, for example, renewable technology. And for them to compete against large multinational companies will be quite difficult in their early stages. They don't have economies of scale. They maybe haven't had a time to get established and started and build their technology and their brand. So in order to protect them within their domestic market from foreign imports, the government may wish to restrict the level of imports coming into the marketplace in that industry. The second one we mentioned was to prevent dumping. Now, dumping occurs when countries release or dump excess supply of products into another market. So for example, agriculture is quite a common example. If we imagine, let's say that Australia had a bumper crop of wheat and they have lots of excess supply, what they might be tempted to do was take that excess supply and sell it into another market, perhaps the UK market. Now, that would drive down the price of wheat in the UK and damage the incomes to farmers in the UK and destabilize their income streams, making investment and life more difficult for those UK-based farmers. So governments will often want to stop countries dumping their excess supply into their markets by restricting the level of imports. A last reason was to protect jobs. So often in particular industries, for example, perhaps the car industry in the United States, they will want to restrict the level of imports to maintain jobs in those industries within their own country, particularly industries that are considered to be very important to those countries. So we've looked at what is meant by protectionism. We're now going to look at the 4 different ways that countries can do it, and then a bit of evaluation. So the first way in which a country can try and restrict the level of imports is through a tariff. And a tariff is a tax, or sometimes called a duty, that raises the price of imported products. And this would be an example of how it works. If we imagine we're talking about cloth, and cloth in Britain costs, let's say, an equivalent $4 a roll to produce, and cloth in America produces $4 a roll. Now, consumers in America would be indifferent between American cloth and British cloth. But if in the United States government wanted their population to buy American, then what they might do is try and make their products, the American cloth, more attractive than the British product by adding on a tariff. And if here they added on a tariff of 25%, that would mean an extra 25% is added to the price, which is $1. So British made cloth would now cost $5 in the United States. So there, the consumer would have a clear decision that they would rather choose the American domestic cloth than the foreign import. These taxes are sometimes referred to as customs duties. And here's a couple of examples. So Mexico imposed a 150% tariff on Brazilian chicken, and the United States, believe it or not, has an 11% import tariff on bicycles from the UK. What are the pros and cons of this approach? Well, the pros are they reduce imports. They also additionally raise tax revenue for the government, and they can do something positive with that tax revenue. The products can still be bought. You could still buy British-made cloth, but it will be available for those people that are prepared to pay the higher price. Any negatives? Well, its effectiveness depends on the price elasticity demand for imports. If consumers considered British-made cloth to be particularly high quality or a strong brand, then actually the increase in price might not lead to much of a reduction in demand. Often it can lead to higher prices for consumers if there's no choice or no domestic alternative. And lastly, it tends to protect less efficient companies. So if a domestic company can't compete on price, but they can because a tariff's in place, then all we're doing is protecting less efficient companies in the economy. Okay, the second way in which government can restrict imports is through quotas. Quotas are limits on the physical amount of products or goods that are allowed to come into the country. So for example, Thailand has imposed a quota of 54,440 tons of corn on China. So that is a limit for the physical amount that can be imported into the country. Pros and cons, again, the pros, it reduces imports and protects domestic companies. This one doesn't involve a higher price for the consumer directly, but cons might be that it limits choice and also would encourage a black market or smuggling to occur. Okay, a third way in which a government could try and restrict imports is through the use of subsidies. A subsidy is a payment from the government to a company within their own country to help that company lower costs and potentially lower prices to gain more sales. So a government might help their own businesses so they can more effectively compete or have a price advantage over foreign imports. An example here would be the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU, where European governments give their farmers subsidies to help lower their costs so the farmers can stay in business and foreign cheaper agricultural products don't drive the domestic farmers out of the market. Some pros of this and cons. Well, the actual price of the products here are reduced, so that would be an advantage. It raises the potential for exports from domestic companies as well. Not only does it protect them from imports within their own market, it might enable them to also export around the world. Some negatives, some cons of subsidies. Well, it increases government spending, and that carries an opportunity cost. What might be the next best alternative for that government spending? It needs to be funded, so it's either that money, the subsidy has to come either through higher taxes or through increased government debt. And again, it helps protect less efficient producers. So perhaps the reason the farmers couldn't compete in the first place is because they're not as efficient as the foreign farmers, but actually by subsidizing them, we're helping to protect less efficient businesses within the economy. The final way in which governments may restrict the level of imports is by introducing legislation, regulations and laws. So for example, complex legal forms to fill in for imports, or health and safety inspections, or specific product specifications, or perhaps environmental regulations would all be ways in which companies might try and block imports from coming into the country. So things to do with labeling, environmental standards, making sure that they come from a particular country of origin, can block other imports from entering the country. They may also raise the costs of importation, for example, lots of form filling and checking. Some pros and cons. Well, an advantage here is that actually having all these regulations in place might improve the quality of any imports that do make it through. Also, they may reduce negative effects on the environment in the wider world and perhaps any negative effects on workers' rights. Some negatives, well, they tend to raise costs and in turn might raise prices for consumers. Loopholes can be found in the systems, and it's difficult to check that these standards have been met all the time and to enforce compliance to make sure that companies actually are meeting these standards. Okay, let's move on to some evaluation of these points. So these would all be positive reasons why protectionism might be introduced, or potential good things. So protecting infant industries, protecting strategic industries, or protecting against import dumping. On the flip side, we might say that these would be negatives from protectionist measures. Higher prices for consumers and perhaps less choice or quality, the risk of retaliation from other countries, and what can often result in what's known as price wars, where one country introduces a tariff, the other does in retaliation, so they up the original tariff, and so on and so on. And lastly, extra costs for exporters, increasing their costs and reducing their profits. The World Trade Organization is an organization that we should be aware of in this regard. They are an organization made up of member governments, and they deal with rules about international trade. And their main objective is to ensure that trade flows smoothly, predictably, and that trade is free. So they try and campaign for governments to agree between each other to remove protectionist measures and to remove trade barriers. And they do this by having large meetings every so often where representatives from different countries go to meet and discuss international trade. And they might say, you know, we will remove our tariff on your bikes if you remove your quota on our agricultural products. And through these rounds of negotiations, the objective of this organization is to encourage trade to be free. So they are very much anti-protectionism. So what might be the impact on businesses of increased protectionism? Well, some positive impacts. If you are a domestic company and your government is introducing protectionist measures, then this may benefit you because you are guaranteed maybe a larger share of your domestic market, and maybe experience less competition. Some negative impacts potentially. Well, if you are a large multinational, then you might find that actually protectionism from another country reduces your ability to access that export market. This reduces your potential to be a large-scale multinational and reduces the potential to benefit from economies of scale. Also, there is political uncertainty associated with protectionism. So, particular countries, you might find that they introduced a protectionist measure that you weren't expecting, and so that can make your business more risky. The larger that you are, there is more political risk associated with them introducing protectionist measures. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by protectionism, 4 different methods of protectionism, and lastly, some ideas about how we might evaluate these and the topic in general. That's it. Thanks very much.